The night was thick, and the cold wind sliced through the silence of the corridors at the military hospital. The clock had already passed midnight when a convoy of black SUVs pulled up in front of the main entrance. At first, the hospital staff did not pay much attention. They were used to the movements of government employees, routine inspections, and ceremonial visits. But everything changed when the doors of the lead vehicle opened, and flanked by Secret Service agents, President Donald Trump stepped out. A murmur spread like wildfire. This was no ordinary visit. There were no cameras, no journalists, no flashes, no rehearsed speeches or theatrical handshakes for the media lenses. It was just him, walking with determination, without the usual pomp that accompanied his public appearances. The hospital's chief physician, Dr. Reynolds, hurried to the entrance, visibly surprised. He didn't know how to proceed. But before he could say anything, Trump raised his hand, cutting off any formality. "I'm not here for politics," he said, his voice firm. "I want to see the soldiers." The hospital corridors were filled with an almost sepulchral silence. The only sound breaking the quiet was the continuous beeping of heart monitors and the soft shuffle of nurses' steps during their rounds. In the rooms, men and women who had given everything for their country were fighting against their pains and scars, some visible, others invisible. Trump walked with keen eyes, surveying the faces he encountered along the way. Unlike other visits that the soldiers had received, there were no forced smiles or empty words. Whatever had brought him there was genuine. A young nurse, Emily, watched from a distance. She had seen politicians around before. They all followed the same script. They came in, shook a few hands, posed for photos, and left without really seeing what was happening beyond the curtains and sterile corridors of the hospital. But something about Trump's presence was different. He stopped beside one of the beds. The young man there did not turn his head, merely staring at the ceiling, lost in his own thoughts. His identification tag revealed his name, James Carter. James had lost both legs in combat. With the loss of his limbs, he had also lost hope. His fiancée had left him, his friends had stopped visiting, and loneliness had become his only companion. When he noticed Trump standing by his side, he sighed. "You don't have to pretend to care," he murmured without even looking away. Trump, however, did not leave. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat next to him. "Tell me your story," he said. James hesitated, but there was something in Trump's tone, something that did not seem forced or rehearsed. For the first time in months, he felt like talking, and he did. He recounted the explosion that took his legs, the despair of the following days, the nightmares, the phantom pain, the feeling of having been discarded. He spoke about the pitying looks he received, about the fear of being forgotten. And Trump listened. He listened without interrupting, without offering empty words of consolation. He just listened. When James finished, Trump remained silent for a moment. "Do you feel that your service meant nothing?" he finally asked. James swallowed hard. "Sometimes, yes." Trump sighed. His expression carried a weight rarely seen. "That's a shame," he said, "because you are a hero, and this country should never forget that." For the first time in a long time, James truly felt seen. Before getting up, Trump placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "You are not alone," he promised. "I won't let you be forgotten." Emily, who had been watching the interaction from afar, felt her heart tighten. She knew all too well the empty look in James's eyes. She had tried to help him before, but he always pushed her away. Now, however, for the first time in months, she saw something different in his eyes. Gathering courage, she approached. "Mr. President," she began hesitantly. "There are others like James, soldiers who have no one." Trump turned to her, his eyes sharp yet understanding. "Then show me." Without hesitation, Emily led him deeper into the hospital. They passed by beds occupied by wounded soldiers, some too weak to speak, but one door caught their attention. The number was 207. "He hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks," Emily explained softly. "He lost more than just his health." Trump nodded. "Let's take a look." Room 207 was dimly lit. There was only a small window through which one could see the night sky. In the center of the room, sitting in a wheelchair, was Sergeant William Reynolds. He gazed out, as if waiting for someone who would never come. Trump entered. William didn't even turn his head. "Another visitor wanting to pity me," he murmured, his voice bitter. Trump sat in a chair in front of him, his hands clasped over his knees. Not pity, just respect. William turned his face, raising an eyebrow. Respect for what? For being too broken to serve? Trump shook his head. For what you sacrificed. For the son who followed in your footsteps. William froze. His son, Lieutenant Jason Reynolds, had died in combat. His name was barely mentioned in the press. "How do you know about that?" whispered William, his voice trembling. His trembling fingers clutched the arms of the wheelchair as he spoke of Jason. How he had saved his unit, as if he had sacrificed himself so that others could live. "They called him a hero for a day," said William bitterly. "Then they forgot." Trump leaned forward. "I won't forget," William scoffed. But there was something in the way Trump said it, an unshakable firmness. "His name will be honored," Trump promised. "I will make sure of that." William's eyes shone. He had spent years drowning in sorrow, convinced that his son's sacrifice had been lost in time. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Trump turned to Emily and the other hospital staff. "I need a list," he said. "All fallen soldiers whose families are struggling, all the veterans who have been forgotten." The staff hesitated. It was not an ordinary request, but no one could deny the sincerity in his voice. A doctor, initially hesitant, raised his head. "We can do that, Mr. President." Trump nodded. "Then let's get to work." And that night, he didn't just shake hands and leave. He sat with the doctors, listened to the nurses, and wrote names with his own hands. He made calls, scheduled meetings, and he began to make change happen. The news of Trump's unexpected visit spread quickly through the hospital corridors. There were no cameras, no public statements, but the soldiers noticed something different. For the first time, someone high up was not there for empty speeches. He was listening. Hours passed, but Trump did not leave. He continued to walk through the military wing, stopping by beds, exchanging words with soldiers, asking about their stories. He did not offer impossible promises, only recognition. When he was about to leave, something made him pause. A small boy, no more than 6 years old, was sitting on a bench in the corridor, holding an old teddy bear. His eyes were red, and his expression was a mixture of curiosity and sadness. Trump knelt down to be at the boy's level. "What's your name, champ?" he asked in a softer tone. The boy hesitated before murmuring, "Michael." A woman standing next to him, her eyes swollen from crying, stepped forward. "My husband, Captain Rodriguez, is in critical condition. We don't know if he's going to make it." Her voice faltered. Trump looked toward the closed door of the ICU and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your father is a fighter, and fighters don't give up." Michael clutched his teddy bear even tighter, trying to believe, but the fear of loss was evident in his gaze. Without hesitation, Trump entered the ICU. Inside, the atmosphere was cold and filled with machines emitting constant beeps. Captain Rodriguez looked fragile, connected to tubes and monitors, his body barely moving. Trump pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Your son is waiting for you," he said, his voice low but firm. "You gave everything for this country, now it's our turn to give back." The only sound in the room was the steady heartbeat on the monitor. Then, as if hearing those words, Captain Rodriguez's fingers moved slightly. His eyelids trembled, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. A nurse monitoring the vital signs choked. "He hasn't shown any movement in days." Trump placed a hand over his. "Hang in there." That night, against all medical predictions, Captain Rodriguez's condition began to stabilize. Before leaving, Trump handed Michael's mother a sealed envelope. "This is for when you're ready," he said. Confused, she accepted the envelope, watching as he walked away. Hours later, when she finally gathered the courage to open it, her breath caught. Inside was a handwritten note by Trump. He thanked her for Captain Rodriguez's sacrifice, for the impact he had made on the country. But that wasn't all. Beside the note was a formal document, a full scholarship for Michael, covering his entire future education. She covered her mouth with her hand, unable to hold back her tears. It wasn't just a letter, it was hope. It was a sign that in her darkest moment, someone still cared. The visit to the hospital marked Trump in a way few things had before. On the way back to the White House, he remained silent, watching the nighttime landscape through the car window. As soon as he arrived at the Oval Office, he sat at his desk and began to act. He made calls. He spoke with legislators, advisors, military officials. He demanded that new initiatives be created to assist veterans. He wanted improvements in mental health, more medical resources and financial support for the families of injured or fallen soldiers. The next morning, his team was surprised by his urgency. "We need action now," he declared, holding papers with detailed notes. "These men and women gave everything. Now it's our turn." And unlike so many other promises made in the past, this time something began to happen. Soldiers who once felt forgotten started receiving supportive calls. Veterans organizations, which had struggled for years to be heard, suddenly found doors open. But Trump refused to turn it into a political spectacle. When questioned by reporters about changes in military funding, he replied simply, "It's the right thing to do." Nurse Emily, who had witnessed everything, still couldn't believe it. She had hoped that the visit was just another fleeting moment, like so many others. But it wasn't. "He really meant what he said," she whispered to a colleague. And for the first time in a long time, hope began to spread through the hospital corridors. Months later, something unexpected happened. A private meeting was organized at the White House, bringing together veterans from across the country. There was no media, no political speeches, just a silent gathering but full of meaning. Among those present was Sergeant William Reynolds. For years, he had drowned in pain and bitterness, convinced that his son's sacrifice had been forgotten. Now there he was, shaking Trump's hand. "You kept your promise," he whispered. Trump just nodded solemnly. James Carter, the young soldier who once had given up on life, was there too. Now he led a support group for wounded veterans. "I'm alive because of that night," he admitted. Trump simply placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Sometimes words were not necessary. James's redemption became a symbol, a beacon of hope for those who believed they were lost. The impact of that night spread. James's support group grew, becoming a national movement, helping thousands of veterans find purpose again. Newspapers began covering the story, but James always returned to the same moment. "He made me believe that I wasn't useless." That's what changed everything. A year later, Trump returned to the military hospital, but this time not as a stranger. Now he was a familiar face. Soldiers who had once been hopeless now greeted him with smiles. James, in his wheelchair, talked with new patients, offering them the same hope that had once been given to him. Emily met him at the entrance. "You did more than just visit," she said, her eyes shining. "You changed lives." Trump smiled, but shook his head. "They changed mine too." As he walked through the corridors, he stopped before a familiar face. Captain Rodriguez, now recovered, stood up and saluted. "I made it." Trump shook his hand. "I never doubted you." As he was about to leave, Sergeant William, leaning on his cane, slowly moved and raised his hand. A salute. One by one, the other soldiers followed. Even those in wheelchairs, even those who could barely lift an arm. The doctors, nurses, the entire hospital staff, everyone was standing. The silence was absolute. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about power. It was about something deeper. Honor, gratitude, and the recognition of sacrifices that could never be repaid. As Trump left the hospital, Emily wiped away a tear. That night would never be forgotten. Months later, a letter arrived at the White House. It was from Emily. She described how that night had transformed the hospital. Soldiers who had once been hopeless now had real support. She didn't expect a reply, but one day she found an official envelope with the White House seal. Inside, a handwritten note from Trump. "Emily, true heroes are people like you. Thank you for what you do. You inspire more than you know." Beside the note was a signed proposal, improvements to military hospitals. She smiled, knowing that it was real. If you liked this story and want to see more content like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any video. See you next time.